Thanksgiving, it seems to me, is about two things. The first is about gratitude and gratefulness, and the second is about how history gets written and remembered. Today, I want to focus on the latter part. It has to do with the history of the Thanksgiving holiday and how it became so popular. We have to ask, why do we all celebrate it each and every year? There is reasons. Now, most of us know the story of the first Thanksgiving, the ones with the Pilgrims and the native Wampanoag at Plymouth Rock in 1621. Many of us were taught that story as children. We also probably know that the common retelling of that story is historically inaccurate and also, at times, problematic. We don't know much about the historical event itself. It was insignificant enough to the Pilgrims that it warranted only a tiny paragraph in one of their journals, 115 words. There was, according to this testimony, entertainment, rejoicing, hunting, shooting of guns in the air, and lots of birds to eat. That's all historians have to go on. Everything else is extrapolation. The Wampanoag left no mention of it at all. There is no evidence, for example, to suggest that it felt like anything like the Thanksgivings we celebrate today. Few of our classic Thanksgiving foods were present. No potatoes, they hadn't migrated up yet from South America. No desserts, no pies, no cranberries, because the Pilgrims had no sugar or flour or even ovens to make them. Even turkey would have been unlikely. Apparently, they are quite fast, and Pilgrims had a hard time catching them. There are stories about them running after them and trying to chase these turkeys. Geese and duck would have been more likely as birds. The truth is that Pilgrims would have hated our modern Thanksgiving holidays. They despised most every holiday, even Christmas and Easter, because they saw them as non-biblical and as idolatrous. There were only three holidays that they liked and acknowledged: the weekly Sabbath, Sunday, and two others, which could only be declared in times of great occasion. One was a day of humiliation and fasting, and the other was a day of thanksgiving. Now, the gathering with the Wampanoag in 1621 was not what the Pilgrims would call the day of Thanksgiving. It was a different thing. A Pilgrim Thanksgiving, that day of Thanksgiving that they would have celebrated would have been solemn and religious with lots of praying. They would not be shooting of guns and feasting and that kind of joyous celebration that happened in 1621. That was a festive party. For the next 200 years after that, people forgot all about the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag's gathering of 1621. Eventually, there did become an annual Thanksgiving holiday, but that was simply a New England harvest festival that had no association at all with the Pilgrims and Wampanoag. No one talked about the first Thanksgiving. No one talked about breaking bread together or about the Wampanoag welcoming the Pilgrims to America or them being friends. Thanksgiving was just a regional holiday that marked the transition from fall to winter, a way to celebrate and be grateful for a year of good crops. So why did this harvest Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag story get connected? And I think that's partially where it gets interested, because the modern Thanksgiving that we celebrate is rooted in a whole history of things. It started, of all places, in the work of a minister, perhaps surprisingly a Unitarian minister, named Alexander Young. In 1841, he published a collection of historical documents from early colonial America, which included a part about the Pilgrims. From all accounts, Reverend Young was earnest, was well-meaning, as many Unitarians are. But like many of us, now and then, he made the mistake of claiming to know something he didn't really know. In discussing the Pilgrims, he cited those 151 words, those describing the 1621 Wampanoag and Pilgrim gathering, and declared that it had been definitively the first Thanksgiving. Now, this had never been suggested before. He had no basis in suggesting it. We can imagine him at the time saying it was harmless conjecture based on scant historical data. He could not have anticipated that this conjecture would change what Thanksgiving was forever. For the first time, that harvest Thanksgiving, already popular, was linked to the idea of the Pilgrims, the Wampanoag, back in 1621, what Reverend Young called the very first Thanksgiving. The idea would obviously catch on. We would learn about it as children, as would many children decades before all of us were born. But it didn't catch on right away, that linkage between harvest Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims and Wampanoag. And this is where the history gets interesting. And this is why Thanksgiving is not just about gratitude, but about how history gets written and remembered. Scholars generally understand that there are three reasons why modern Thanksgiving, the holiday that embraces both the harvest and that meal in 1621, why that took off when it did. Because although Young linked the ideas in 1841, it wasn't until well after the Civil War, and almost until the 20th century, that modern Thanksgiving came about as the way we understand it. Three things, according to scholars, had to happen first. The first is the most straightforward. Before the Civil War, Thanksgiving was considered a New England Yankee holiday, and the South wanted nothing to do with it. It was considered a thing that the Yankees did, and it wasn't until after the war, the Civil War, once animosity between these regions had died down and there was a need for national unity, the holiday began to move beyond the Northeast and throughout the rest of the country. The second thing that needed to happen in order for modern Thanksgiving to come about was that the United States government needed to finish colonizing the West. In the late 1800s, the West was still a war zone. And for many white Americans, indigenous people were a real and present enemy. Now, a holiday that suggested friendship and fellowship between whites and natives would have felt deeply uncomfortable and even offensive. It was a non-starter. So it was only after, and it could only be after, colonization of the West was complete, the native tribes out west were subjugated, that white Americans could sanitize their relationship with indigenous people and make Thanksgiving palatable. Indigenous people first had to be controlled and diminished for Thanksgiving to be a national holiday. There could be no confusion that Pilgrims were not first and the Wampanoag were not second. Once that was assured, the Thanksgiving revelry with the Wampanoag could be reduced to old-fashioned nostalgia, hearkening back to another time, a convenient whitewash of more than 2 centuries of brutality. With the West won, Thanksgiving allowed white America to feel as if the natives had actually invited their conquerors in. It was okay, everything that happened. We were just friends. Everything would be forgiven. The third and final thing that had to happen for modern Thanksgiving to take off, that harvest Thanksgiving and the story of the Pilgrims and Wampanoag, final thing that had to happen was the immigration crisis of the late 1800s. Millions of European immigrants were fleeing hunger, war and poverty and were landing on American shores. Not since the initial colonization had America experienced such a disruptive influx of people. And they were different people than those who were there already. Many were Catholic, unlike the predominantly Protestant American establishment. Many were not Anglo-Saxon. Many were poor or seen as too fond of beer and drinking, or spoke languages that were not English. Many white Americans worried about how this would harm the country. They worried they would lose the virtues that they held dear and that the country would change to become unrecognizable from what they knew. It's familiar stuff today. So what they needed back in the late 1800s was a story about what good immigrants looked like. About immigrants who embodied American values, and a story that helped all these newcomers coming in understand what America was about and what was expected of immigrants. And so they looked back and they said, the Pilgrims are the perfect match. They were God-fearing. They were hardworking. They suffered terribly and faced great obstacles, and yet they overcame. They didn't complain. They were family-oriented. They believed in freedom and democracy. Now, all of this, of course, is part of the myth, conveniently ignoring the Pilgrim capacity for violence and cruelty and arrogance, ignoring that they did not in any way believe in modern ideas of democracy and freedom. They wanted religious theocracy. But in this storytelling of the modern Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims were useful because they could be uplifted as a model immigrant. Thanksgiving became a vehicle for celebrating what America was, how immigrants needed to be and should be, and what values American society believed in. And if you didn't fit that mold, maybe America wasn't the place for you. And so with these three things, our modern holiday took off. It became palatable. And today it's easy for us to see Thanksgiving as just about gratitude and pumpkins and fall leaves and good food, as only giving thanks for what we have. And it can be about all those things, and those things are great. Gratitude is so important, spiritually, holistically, for our own well-being. But that version of Thanksgiving that just focuses on the gratitude is highly sanitized. It's really important that we don't ignore why it became popular in the first place. That the reason we all celebrate Thanksgiving is not because our ancestors were so enlightened that they just knew gratitude was the spiritual practice we needed to embrace, but because of other darker reasons that motivated many of our ancestors to make this our annual practice. Thanksgiving became popular because a certain group of Americans wanted a new American story. They wanted a story that articulated what it meant to be a good immigrant, that the immigrant masses needed to be a little less different than they were, and a little bit more like the people the Protestant Americans wanted them to be. And they also wanted a story about how colonized people should be good subjects, marginalized and conquered and controllable. That Thanksgiving could only be popular once the native people had been decimated and that white hegemony had been established is telling. Indigenous people are not just people like them, could only be tolerated, according to the Thanksgiving myth, when they were agreeable, friendly, generous, and gave everyone else a reason to be grateful for them. I think most criticisms of Thanksgiving center on the false history of that very first gathering in 1621. And those are important critiques. But it's different than what I'm trying to say today. It's equally important to understand the historical roots of the holiday itself, how it evolved the way it did, because the history of that impacts us just as much. Its motivations are still with us today. Thanksgiving is a holiday that had and still has an agenda. The battle for America right now is one that echoes through this holiday, and it is this: who gets to tell the American story? And what is that story? The history of the Thanksgiving holiday is a case study in how history gets written. It shows us how most of history, even innocuous things like Thanksgiving holidays, all about gratitude, who could argue with that, have been used by those in power, those who have been colonizers, to define who is good and worthy and who belongs, to determine who gets to claim this country as their own and who gets to be a guest here. Modern Thanksgiving was created to reinforce norms of behavior for those on the margins, whether they were immigrants or indigenous. The implication is that America was never truly for them and never would be unless they follow directions carefully. There is, of course, another way, the way of believing that America is for all of us, not just for some of us, that our history and our myths, even the inaccurate ones, don't presume that there is a we and an ours, a way of recognizing that throughout history, words like we and ours are used by those in power to center themselves, to write their own stories, and to use them for their own ends. Even in writing this sermon, I had to catch myself multiple times talking about how our ancestors celebrate Thanksgiving and how we tell the story of the first Thanksgiving. Who is the we? Is it all of us, or just some of us who are used to being in the middle and defining the stories? Certainly the Wampanoag today don't use we when talking about the Pilgrims or those who made the holiday a national one. I suspect there are many other Americans who wouldn't use we or ours either. America is at its most beautiful and true when it realizes just how many we's there are in this country. That there are not just mine or yours or the people we know or the people who've always been. America has as our ancestors not just the Pilgrims, but the Wampanoag and the refugee and those brought here in slavery and many others whose history we have forgotten. It is not just one group of people who get to say who America is or who Americans are. I'm not saying we can't enjoy Thanksgiving. I plan to fly out this week and enjoy all the food and family I can manage. I hope that you do the same and that you enjoy and have all of the things of gratitude that you can embrace. But we should do it and be aware also that there is a single story, a story here that privileges one perspective, an historically oppressive perspective, a perspective that has had the power to portray certain people as better than others and has done so with that power. And we should think about how common this is everywhere we go, with all the stories that are told, that we hear and we tell and we perpetuate, the holidays and in the institutions, how power creates the narratives through those who have it. This is a struggle that none of us, anywhere, are immune from. We face it here at Fourth Universalist as well. Part of why we're degendering our restrooms. Because until recently, the we of the congregation was almost exclusively cisgendered people, and we didn't need to think about why simple male-female restrooms were problematic, unwelcoming, and unsafe. The experience of those who are transgender and non-binary were not being told. They were not part of the we and the our equation. It's also why I expect the person of color affinity group last week in the service called their service Claiming Our Space. Because this congregation, as with many congregations, has a tendency to operate mostly from a perspective that we means white people and white norms, and that part of being diverse is letting our congregation no longer be dominated by one simple story or perspective. Everyone gets to claim this space as their own. With the Thanksgiving holiday here at Fourth Universalist, our work is to see that our view as individuals, as a society, as a congregation, is often a narrow one, that it can exclude and has often been designed to exclude. It's not just accidental. And then we can pry our minds and our hearts and everything we encounter open, the stories, the systems, the communities, the holidays, so that others can belong and that no one feels left out. Thanksgiving is a moment, a time to remember that our reality is not the reality. It is certainly okay to have your own perspective and your own history and holidays and stories. What's not okay is insisting that ours is or should be the best, the most valid, and the truest, and ignoring how what we celebrate is rooted in histories of oppression and marginalization. It doesn't have to be this way going forward, but it certainly has been. Change can start with the place where it began, here at Thanksgiving. Pilgrims may have hated this holiday, but we can make it an annual tradition that is better than what it has been. A reminder to ourselves each and every year for the propensity of stories to be written to serve those who tell them. That stories are written by those in power to exclude those without it. And that even so, we as thinking, critical, sensitive, empathetic people can learn to be skeptical and brave enough to change our ways of telling stories, to pry open the doors of our hearts and minds to let others in, and make sure the stories that are told, the holidays we celebrate, and the communities that we love all do the same. And that would be something, I think, to be truly grateful for. May it be so, and amen.